Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about communities. So we're going to just do a bit of an introduction and then we're going to look at different types of interactions that we find within communities. The first thing we need to just recap is looking at the levels of biological organization. So remember that we're going to start off at the level of atoms, and then we have atoms that combine with one another to form molecules. Molecules are then going to interact with each other and form organelles. And then once we have organelles, we can have cells being formed. So if we have a look at this diagram over here, we have an atom. Atoms join together to form molecules such as DNA, such as proteins. That all works together to form our organelles. In this case, we're looking at the chloroplast. And then we have a whole range of organelles coming together to form the cell. Our next level of organization is going to be the tissues. So tissues are going to form when we have groups of cells that are going to work together to perform a specific function. In this case, we're looking at tissues within the leaf of the plant. Then we'll have tissues that are going to work together for an even broader function, and we call this collection of tissues an organ. So in this case, the leaf is going to be our organ. Different organs will then coordinate and work with one another to form an organ system. And then all the different organ systems within that organism are going to interact and work together to form the organism as a whole. Our next level of organization is going to be the population. So the population is where we have a group of individuals and they're the same species. They're going to be living in a shared environment. They're going to be interacting with one another and they're going to be breeding with one another. The next level of organization is our community, and that's where we're focusing on today. So our community is where we now have individuals of different species sharing the same environment. Of course, because they're different species, they will not be breeding with each other, but they will be interacting with one another in that environment. Our next level of organization is going to be the ecosystem. So the ecosystem is where we bring in the non-living parts of the environment. So for example, here our ecosystem is going to be all the plants, all the trees, so everything that's living, all the animals, as well as the non-living parts of the environment. So the rocks, the air, the sunlight, all of that together is composing that ecosystem. And then finally, our last level of organization is the biosphere. So that encompasses the entire planet as well as the atmosphere surrounding the globe where life is possible. Alright, so once again, just having a look at this, when we have a community, we have a group of interacting populations. So now we have individuals of different species interacting with one another. So the community is just our living factors, our living organisms, so the biotic component of that environment. The ecosystem is where we now bring in the biotic and the abiotic, so the living and the non-living components of the environment. Communities are going to vary in size. So for example, if we had a look at this picture over here, we could have a community just on the forest floor, including all the plants growing on the forest floor and all the animals that live there. We could have a community of organisms living just inside a pool of water. So all the microorganisms or other organisms living just inside a pool of water on this forest floor. That community could also extend all the way up to the treetops. So we could include all the plants, animals on the ground, as well as all the way up to the treetops. So communities are going to vary in size. When we talk about a community, an important factor that we want to consider is diversity. And diversity is made up of two components, species richness and species abundance. Now, species richness is a number that looks at what is the total number of species that we have living in this community. Our relative abundance is looking at the proportion of the community that each species is going to occupy. So both species richness and relative abundance need to be taken into consideration when determining the diversity of a community. So let's say, for example, we had a community that had 100 species. So 100 species, that is telling us the species richness. But now we also need to take into consideration the relative species abundance if we're going to determine the diversity of the community. The diversity of the community would be considered low if we had one species that was dominating that community. So let's say 99% of the community was made up by a single species, whereas the other 99 species only made up 1% of the community. This would be considered low diversity. On the other hand, if we had each of those 100 species in the community contributing 1% of that community, now we would have a high diversity. Alright, so let's have a look at this example, deciding which of these two communities has a higher diversity. If we look at community 1, we have a species A, B, C, and D, and we find the same in community 2. So they have the same species richness. Now we need to look at the relative abundance. In community 1, each of those species is occupying 25% of the community. Whereas in community 2, if we have a look, species A is occupying the majority. So 80% of that community is composed of species A, whereas species B, C, and D make up much smaller percentages. So if we compare these two communities, we can see that community A has a higher diversity. The interaction between species within a community is really important because it determines the structure of that community. It determines where organisms are going to live and how abundant they're going to be. These interactions can also drive natural selection and evolution. And when we have two species that evolve together, we call this co-evolution. So for example, let's say we have a plant and a herbivore. This is a predator-prey interaction. The plant is going to evolve ways to prevent the herbivore from eating it. And as it does that, the herbivore will evolve ways in order to deal with those preventative measures that the plant has come up with. And so we'll see this constant back and forth evolution between the two as they evolve together. Let's have a look at this specific example over here with the Central American acacia species and the ant. The acacia species has hollow thorns and it has pores at the base of its leaves that secrete a sweet nectar. The ant builds its nest inside these hollow thorns and it feeds on that nectar. The other thing we see with the ant is the ant has defenses against herbivores. Now this is an example of coevolution. The ant would not have needed to have defenses against herbivores unless it evolved living on this acacia species, because herbivores wouldn't naturally eat the ant. Once again, the acacia species, it evolved these hollow thorns and this nectar in order to attract the ant and keep the ant living on it so that it could get protection from the herbivores. When we talk about interactions between species, we characterize them based on how each species involved in this interaction is affected, whether the interaction affects them positively or negatively. Positively meaning it increases their fitness and survival rate, negatively meaning it would decrease their fitness and survival rate. So let's have a look at each of these examples. Firstly, competition. In competition, both species are going to be affected negatively because both species are trying to use a limited resource that the other one needs. When we talk about symbiotic relationships, these relationships involve individuals that live on or in one another. And we have different types. We have parasitism, we have mutualism, and we have commensalism. In parasitism, one organism benefits whilst the other is harmed. In mutualism, both organisms benefit. Kind of think of it like the feeling is mutual. We're both happy to be in this relationship. And then in commensalism, one organism benefits and the other is neither harmed nor does it benefit from the relationship. Our third type of interactions we have over here is our consumer resource interactions. So this includes things like herbivory and predation. So in this case, one individual is going to benefit from this interaction and the other is going to be harmed in some way. So let's start off talking about competition. So if we have a look at this graph over here, and we're talking about different resources that we have in that environment. We have two species sharing that environment, species A and species B. So species A is making use of all these resources in the environment, while species B needs these resources in that environment. If they're using separate resources, so for example, species A is using these, species B doesn't use those, species B is using these, and A doesn't need to make use of those. Those types of resources are not going to create competition between the two species. However, competition is going to come about when they're trying to share a resource and that resource is limited in some way within that environment. So competition is therefore defined as an interaction where we have two or more organisms that are trying to use the same limited resource within their environment. And because both organisms are using resources that the other one needs, both species are going to be impacted in a negative way. And we have two types of competition that we find: intraspecific competition and interspecific competition. Intraspecific competition is actually between individuals of the same species. So think of intra with an A and same with an A, within the same species. Interspecific with an E, on the other hand, that is going to be between species, between different types of species. So let's say, for example, we have a garden and we want to plant a tomato garden. We would want to make sure that we space our tomato plants out so that we don't get intra-specific competition. We would also want to make sure that we go into our garden weekly and we pull out any weeds, because that would be reducing our intra-specific competition. Let's talk about symbiotic relationships. So this is where we have one organism living on or in the other organism. And we have our three types: mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. Starting off with mutualism. So in this case, both species involved are going to benefit from this relationship. They will have improved fitness and they will survive better because they're in this relationship with the other individual. So for example, over here we have the rhino and the oxpecker. So in this relationship, the rhino is gaining pest control because the oxpecker is eating all sorts of ticks and mites off the back of the rhino. Of course, the oxpecker is gaining food from this relationship. Another thing that the rhino actually gains from this partnership is protection, which might sound a little strange since the oxpecker is really tiny. How does it protect the rhino? Well, in fact, what happens is the oxpecker is like a watchman, and they're watching out constantly for danger. And when they sense danger or they see something, what they do is they fly up in the air and they give a loud screech, and this warns the rhino that there is danger around them, and so the rhino can take off and run for protection. Let's have a look at this example over here. So we have a flower with some kind of insect acting as a pollinator. So of course the insect is gaining food, it's gaining nectar from that plant, and the flower is gaining reproduction because its pollen is being spread to a nearby flower, allowing it to reproduce. Our last example over here is the plant root and the mycorrhizal fungi. So in this case, think about the structure of the plant root and its function. The root is there to obtain water and nutrients from the environment. The plant root associating with the fungi is going to increase the surface area of that root, allowing for greater water and nutrient absorption. What is the fungus going to gain from this relationship? Well, it's going to gain some carbon compounds that are made by the plant during photosynthesis, because remember, fungi are unable to photosynthesize. So both our plant and our fungi are benefiting from this relationship. Okay, so if we look at commensalism, in this case now, one organism benefits from the relationship, whilst the other one does not benefit and is not harmed either. So the example we have over here is the cattle egret and cattle. The cattle egret kind of hangs around the cattle, and as the cattle walks through the grass, it stirs up insects that the cattle egret is able to eat. So the cattle egret is gaining easy access to food, whilst the cattle is really not gaining or being harmed in that relationship. This example over here you've probably seen around Florida. So we have the Spanish moss and the oak tree. The oak tree is not benefiting or being harmed in this relationship. It's the Spanish moss that is benefiting from this relationship. So being in the oak tree, the Spanish moss is off the ground, so it's away from predators. Also, being higher up means it has better access to sunlight, so it can photosynthesize. Our last type of symbiotic relationship is parasitism. So in parasitism, the one organism is going to benefit whilst the other one is harmed. The organism benefiting is the one that we call the parasite. The one being harmed is known as the host. And often our parasites will try to keep that host organism alive, because if that host organism is alive, they have a source of food or a place to live. Our parasites are going to be found in all kingdoms. So we find them in bacteria, archaea, we have fungi that are parasites, we even have animals and plants that are parasites as well. So the example over here, the common flea, all right, we're all familiar with that one. It lives on our pets, it irritates our pets, it has a place to live and reproduce, and it has a food source, and our poor pets are going to get itchy bites and scratchy bites and be harmed from this relationship. These two examples over here are of plant parasites, so dodder and mistletoe. They live on other plants and they actually access the xylem and phloem of those plants. So they steal water, they steal nutrients, and they're able to steal carbon compounds that are made during photosynthesis by the other plant. So normally the host plant will be stunted in growth because our parasite is stealing nutrients from them. So our next type of interaction is herbivory predation. A herbivore is going to be an animal that's going to eat plants, while a predator is going to be an animal that eats other animals. In this case, you can see that our predator or our herbivore is going to be benefiting at the expense of either the plant or the animal that's getting eaten. Herbivory and predation are large forces that drive evolution because our plants and our prey need to evolve defense mechanisms to deal with their predators. So some defense mechanisms we might see in plants are things like thorns and toxic chemicals that could deter our herbivores. Things that we find in our predators include things like warning coloration. So sometimes we see animals that are very brightly colored, and this is a warning to other animals telling them that, hey, we're toxic, don't eat us. We also see camouflage. So on this picture over here, we have a little pygmy seahorse, and he's hiding over there in that coral. Of course, if you can't be seen, you can't be eaten. And then this last evolutionary trait over here we see is mimicry. So in mimicry, what happens is an animal will actually mimic the warning colorations of another animal. So it itself is not poisonous or dangerous, but it takes on the coloration of something that is poisonous or dangerous to try to trick its predator into not eating it. So this is a common one we have in Florida. We have our poisonous coral snake, and then we have our scarlet king snake, which is not poisonous but has the same coloration as that coral snake. Okay, let's talk about the term keystone species. Now, a keystone species is an organism that plays a very vital role in its community. Often it makes up a small mass in the community, but it has a very large impact on the diversity of that community. So the example we have up here is one that we find in Florida, the gopher tortoise. The gopher tortoise builds a large burrow that houses many other species inside, thereby increasing the diversity of their community. An otter is another example of a keystone species. Otters feed on sea urchins, and if otter numbers drop within their communities, the sea urchins have no predators to keep them in check, and so their populations explode. Sea urchins eat kelp, and in fact they feed on the holdfasts of the kelp, destroying kelp forests. Now, kelp forests provide habitat as well as food for many other different species. So if those kelp forests are removed, those species that depend on that kelp forest are also going to be removed from that community. Now, having a look at invasive species, an invasive species is something that is non-native to the environment. And because it's non-native, it hasn't evolved with the other species in that community. So it doesn't have these evolutionary relationships. It doesn't have strong predators to keep its numbers down. The organisms that it preys on within that community don't have good defenses against this invasive species, and so they can easily be wiped out and led to extinction. So invasive species are really dangerous within our communities. So let's have a look at some of the examples up here. Our zebra mussels, these are native to Russia, and they were brought to the Great Lakes in the 1980s within the ballast water of ships. Now, these mussels are much better at obtaining food, so they're outcompeting the native mussels and pretty much taking over those communities. The next example we have over here is the Burmese python. So this Burmese python is native to Southeast Asia, but is causing havoc in Florida down in the Everglades. It's thought to have been released either intentionally or accidentally by pet owners. The python is feeding on a range of birds and mammals that haven't evolved techniques to deal with this predator, and so they're getting wiped out. The last example we have is our shiprat. Shiprat is native to India and has pretty much spread around the world, traveling on ships, and has caused havoc specifically on small islands where it's been able to wipe out populations of birds and mammals. Alright, so go ahead, pause your video, answer these questions, and then when you're ready, come back and we'll go through the answers together. So firstly, define an ecological community. So when we have a community, we have populations of different species. They're living in the same environment now, and they're interacting with one another. What is the difference between species richness and relative abundance? And what are these factors used to determine? Well, these factors are both used to determine the diversity of a community. If we talk about species richness, this is the total number of species that we find in that community, whereas their species abundance, that is their relative numbers that they appear in. Name and define ways in which species interact. Give an example of each. So we had competition, where both individuals are going to be impacted negatively because they're trying to use the same limited resource. So we had both intraspecific competition, which was within the same species, and interspecific competition between individuals of different species. Then we had all our symbiotic relationships. So mutualism was where both individuals benefited from the relationship. An example would be our plant root and the mycorrhizae fungal. We then had commensalism, where one individual benefits and the other is not harmed or does not benefit either from the relationship. It's unaffected. And the example here we could use would be the cattle egret and the cattle, where the cattle egret gain easy access to food and the cattle are unaffected by the relationship. Our third type of symbiotic interaction that we discussed was parasitism. So in this case, the parasite is going to benefit and the host is going to be harmed. So maybe an example that we find in humans, malaria. Malaria would be considered a parasite. So the malaria has a nice place to live, to reproduce, food source, and the human is going to be harmed in that process. And then the last type of interaction that we spoke about was our consumer resource interactions. So where we had our predators eating prey and our herbivores eating plants. Okay, so what is the difference between a keystone species and an invasive species? Well, basically a keystone species is something you want in the community. An invasive species you definitely don't want to be present. So keystone species, they're present in small amounts and they increase community diversity. So the example there was our otter. Whereas invasive species, they are not originally from that community. They're introduced normally because of humans, maybe people releasing pets accidentally or on purpose. And because they haven't evolved with other individuals inside that community, the other individuals are at a disadvantage, and often it can lead to extinction of certain species within that community. So an example of an invasive species there would be the Burmese python. Thanks for watching.